What if one of the greatest psychological minds of the 20th century tried to warn us about something, and we ignored him? Carl Jung didn't spend his final years repeating theories. He wasn't just reflecting on dreams or writing about archetypes. Instead, he began to whisper something deeper, something far beyond the pages of textbooks and lectures. A truth that didn't just challenge psychology, it challenged the very direction humanity was headed. And yet, no one really listened. He spoke not to shock, but to prepare us for a spiritual crisis, for a collapse in meaning, for a world that would one day lose touch with its own soul. A message that wasn't just personal, it was collective and urgent. But somehow, this final message, the one Jung hinted at in interviews, in private letters, and in quiet conversations, never quite reached the spotlight. Why? Maybe it was too uncomfortable. Maybe it didn't fit the narrative of science. Or maybe we just weren't ready to hear it. But now, with rising anxiety, collective burnout, and spiritual confusion spreading like wildfire, we have to ask, what did Carl Jung see coming that the rest of us missed? In this video, we're diving deep into Jung's final warning, what it was, why it matters now more than ever, and what it means for you. Because sometimes the most important truths aren't the ones shouted from podiums. They're the ones whispered before the end, waiting for someone like you to finally listen. So what exactly was Carl Jung trying to tell us before he died? This wasn't about psychology as we normally understand it, not diagnoses, not theories, not academic models. In the final years of his life, Jung began to shift his attention from the clinical to the cosmic. He started speaking in a quieter but far more urgent tone. Through scattered journal entries, private letters to colleagues, and a handful of personal conversations, a new theme began to emerge. He was no longer just concerned with the structure of the psyche. He was worried about the state of the soul. Jung began to speak of a spiritual danger, one far greater than any neurosis or trauma he'd seen in individuals. He was pointing to something bigger, something collective. In his words, humanity was drifting into what he called soul sickness, a condition marked not by physical illness, but by emotional numbness, spiritual confusion, and a disconnection from what makes life truly meaningful. And here's the terrifying part. He believed this wasn't just affecting a few people here and there. He believed this was the direction the entire modern world was heading. He wrote that humans had become so obsessed with progress, with science, with rationality, that we had forgotten something essential, our inner life. Yes, we were advancing technologically. Yes, we were becoming more efficient, more connected, more smart. But Jung saw something else. Underneath all of that, we were becoming hollow, disconnected from nature, disconnected from each other, and most dangerously disconnected from ourselves. He once said people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. And he wasn't being metaphorical. To Jung, the soul wasn't some abstract religious idea. It was the very core of who you are. The self, the source of your dreams, your pain, your potential, your truth. And what happens when a culture avoids its soul? Jung had a chilling answer. It starts projecting its inner conflicts outward onto politics, onto war, onto scapegoats. The shadow, everything we repress, deny, and fear within ourselves, begins to spill out into the world. He believed this was at the root of humanity's most dangerous behaviors, not just in individuals, but in nations, in ideologies, in the systems we create to avoid looking inward. And let's pause for a second. Doesn't that sound eerily familiar? We live in an age of constant stimulation, but increasing loneliness, an age of infinite information, but shrinking wisdom, We have everything we need, and yet so many of us feel anxious, aimless, emotionally starved. Jung saw it coming. He wasn't just warning us about psychological distress, he was warning us about spiritual collapse. He feared that if we didn't reconnect with the deeper parts of ourselves, if we didn't integrate the shadow, listen to our dreams, honor our mythic nature, we would begin to unravel. From the inside out. And this wasn't a fringe idea for him. It was central to everything he taught. He believed the healing of the world depended on the individuation of each person. That if individuals learned to confront their own unconscious, their own shadow, and move toward wholeness, society itself would change. But that's not what happened. Instead, most of the world took his work and stopped at the surface. The psychological establishment absorbed his early ideas, introvert-extrovert archetypes, dream analysis, but largely ignored the deeper spiritual core. The part where he said healing wasn't just about thinking better, it was about becoming whole. The part where he said society couldn't be fixed without first facing what lies in the human heart. The part where he said the future of humanity depended on our willingness to return to the soul. That's the part we didn't want to hear. That's the part we still try to ignore. And maybe that's the part that matters most. Let me ask you something. Have you ever felt like something in modern life just doesn't sit right? Like we're missing something essential, but you can't quite name it? That's the soul speaking. Jung believed that voice, the quiet one underneath the noise, is our greatest guide. But we've trained ourselves to drown it out. We fill the silence. We scroll through distraction. We push our feelings aside. But the soul doesn't go away. It waits. It waits for us to slow down, to go inward, to remember. And Jung knew if we keep ignoring it, if we keep turning away, eventually we'll have no choice but to face the consequences. That's the message he tried to leave us with. Not one of fear, but of urgent hope. Because we're not powerless. We can reconnect. We can do the work. We can become whole again, not just individually, but as a world. But it starts by asking, what have I been avoiding? What parts of myself have I pushed into the shadow? And what would it mean to come back to the soul? This isn't about religion. It's not about dogma. It's about remembering who we are beneath the noise of the world. And that more than anything is what Carl Jung was trying to tell us. So if Carl Jung saw all this coming, if he warned us about the spiritual dangers of modern life, why didn't anyone listen to answer that we need to understand when he was saying it? Jung's later years came during a time of profound global upheaval. World War II had just ended. Entire nations were rebuilding from the rubble, physically, politically, and emotionally. The world was focused on survival, on reconstruction, on progress. New technologies were emerging. Economies were recovering. There was a collective push towards science, reason, and logic. Humanity had seen what unchecked ideology could do, and the response was to double down on rationality. In this context, Jung's message felt inconvenient. It didn't fit the post-war narrative. It wasn't about productivity or rebuilding economies. It was about looking inward, about healing the soul. But the soul wasn't on the agenda. In fact, anything that hinted at the mystical, the unconscious, or the symbolic was often seen as soft, unscientific, even dangerous. People were traumatized, yes. But they wanted answers, not archetypes. They wanted facts, not feelings. Blueprints, not dreams. And so Jung's deeper message, the one about the soul, about the shadow, about the inner world, got quietly shelved. Even many of his own students and colleagues began distancing themselves from his spiritual side. Some admired his earlier work, but dismissed his later reflections as too mystical or philosophically indulgent. They wanted to preserve his legacy as a psychologist, not a prophet. Not someone speaking about dreams, death, and individuation as a sacred path. But here's the irony. The very things they tried to ignore were the very truths Jung believed mattered most. He once said, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another." There is no recipe for living that suits all cases. What he meant was, healing is personal. Inner truth is individual. And we cannot expect rational formulas to answer spiritual questions. But that's what the world wanted back then: predictability, structure, and control. So we packaged psychology into systems. We turned therapy into symptom management. We focused on behavior instead of meaning. And Jung's final insights about the human soul's hunger, about the danger of neglecting the unconscious, were labeled as interesting, but impractical. Think about it. Would a post-war world hungry for material security really prioritize dream work, shadow integration, spiritual wholeness? Not likely. And yet, that's precisely what Jung said we needed most. He saw that without facing our inner world, all our outer progress would eventually collapse under the weight of our unresolved wounds. But here's the truth no one wanted to hear. Real healing doesn't happen by fixing what's outside. It begins by turning inward into the uncomfortable, the chaotic, the unknown. And back then, that idea was just too much. It threatened the myth of progress. It challenged the illusion that science alone could save us. It reminded people that beyond their jobs, their politics, their rational minds, there was something deeper, something unresolved, waiting to be heard. And people weren't ready to hear it. In fact, many still aren't. Even today, we find ways to dismiss the inner world. We label it woo-woo. We mock the spiritual. We distract ourselves with endless information and avoid true introspection. But maybe that's changing, because deep down, something's breaking. We're starting to feel the emptiness behind constant productivity, the anxiety that comes with being always connected, the subtle grief of not knowing who we really are beneath the noise. Maybe now, after decades of avoiding the soul, people are finally beginning to realize what Jung was trying to say, that no amount of outer advancement will ever replace the work of inner awakening. And maybe that's why his words feel more relevant now than ever before. Let me ask you, have you ever felt like the world around you was speeding up, but something inside you was slowing down? Like the more advanced we become, the less we seem to know ourselves. That's the feeling Jung was trying to give language to. He knew that without confronting the unconscious, without acknowledging the symbolic life, we become spiritually lost, even if we appear successful on the outside. He didn't reject science. He didn't ask us to stop thinking. He simply reminded us that we're more than neurons, more than behavior, more than measurable outcomes. We are souls, and a soul that's ignored doesn't disappear. It grows restless. It speaks through anxiety. It dreams. It aches. And eventually, it demands to be heard. So the question isn't just, why didn't they listen back then? The real question is, are we ready to listen now? Because the message hasn't changed. It's just been waiting. Waiting for someone like you to slow down long enough to hear it. So, what if Carl Jung was right? What if the quiet warning he left us in his final years isn't just theory anymore, but something we're now living through? Look around. We're in the middle of what many are calling a mental health crisis. Depression rates are soaring. Anxiety is becoming the norm. Suicide, especially among young people, is climbing. And even when things seem fine on the surface, jobs, relationships, routines, there's still this gnawing sense of disconnection. of emptiness. You can feel it, can't you? That quiet ache that something is missing. But you're not sure what. Jung predicted this decades ago, not as a prophet with a crystal ball, but as a man deeply tuned in to the inner workings of the human soul. He saw that if humanity continued to neglect its inner life, if we kept avoiding the uncomfortable parts of ourselves, the questions we're afraid to ask, the feelings we try to suppress, something would eventually break. And maybe it already has. He once said people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. And that's exactly what we've been doing. We scroll endlessly through content that never fills us. We chase productivity like its purpose. We numb ourselves with overconsumption distractions, comparison noise. But the soul doesn't go away. It waits. And when it's been ignored too long, it starts speaking through symptoms: burnout, existential dread, that strange emptiness, even in moments of success. We're living in a time where people have more access to information than ever, yet more confusion about who they are. We have more technology, more speed, more convenience, and yet fewer meaningful connections, fewer quiet moments, fewer moments of being. Jung called this the loss of the symbolic life. When a person or a culture disconnects from the myths, dreams, and rituals that give life depth, we become spiritually starved. And we try to feed that hunger with things that don't nourish us. But here's the surprising twist. Despite all the chaos, all the confusion, something else is happening too. People are waking up. More than ever before, there's a growing movement of individuals turning inward. They're not waiting for the world to give them answers. They're starting to ask better questions. They're meditating. They're journaling. They're learning about shadow work, inner child, healing archetypes, and spiritual awakening. They're not afraid to ask, "Who am I?" Really, just look at what's trending across YouTube, TikTok, books, podcasts. Searches for terms like spiritual healing, emotional detox, and shadow integration have exploded in recent years. Bestsellers on personal transformation, trauma recovery, and soulful living are flying off the shelves. Online communities around mindfulness, depth psychology, and conscious living are growing faster than ever. Even the term individuation, once locked away in Jungian literature, is starting to make its way into mainstream conversation. So what's happening? Maybe the very crisis Jung predicted is becoming the catalyst we needed. Maybe the breakdown was always meant to lead to a breakthrough. And maybe, just maybe, we're finally ready to hear what he tried to tell us all those years ago. Let me ask you this. Have you ever found yourself searching for something deeper, but couldn't explain what you were looking for? Have you ever felt like the world's answers weren't satisfying anymore? Like they were too shallow for the questions your soul was asking? That's not weakness. That's awakening. And Carl Jung believed that kind of awakening is the real start of transformation. He didn't believe healing came from suppressing the darkness. He believed it came from facing it, integrating it, becoming whole, not by becoming perfect, but by becoming honest with yourself. He once wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." That's what we're being asked to do now, collectively and individually. And it's not easy. It means slowing down in a world that rewards speed. It means feeling deeply in a culture that tells you to stay numb. It means stepping into your story, fully shadow and all. But here's the good news. You're not alone. Millions of people are starting this journey quietly, courageously. They're choosing to listen to their dreams, to examine their patterns, to stop running and finally turn inward. And every time someone does that, every time someone listens to their soul instead of avoiding it, Jung's voice echoes a little louder. His warning is no longer being ignored. It's being lived through. It's becoming the doorway to something more meaningful. So maybe the question isn't, are we in crisis? Maybe the better question is, are we finally remembering who we are? Because the very symptoms that seem like problems, depression, disconnection, confusion, might actually be invitations. They're signals from the soul saying, hey, I'm still here. You've forgotten me, but I haven't forgotten you. And when you answer that call, when you begin to reconnect with the inner world, you don't just heal yourself. You begin to heal something much bigger. That's the legacy Jung left us. A map back to the self, not to follow blindly, but to walk in your own way, in your own time. He didn't want to be worshipped. He wanted us to wake up. And maybe that's exactly what's happening now. So now we come to the end. But maybe it's really just the beginning. Carl Jung saw something that most people around him either ignored or weren't ready to face. He wasn't speaking about surface-level stress or modern distractions. He was pointing to a spiritual crisis, a deep rupture between who we are and who we pretend to be. He warned us about what happens when a society becomes so focused on external progress that it forgets its inner life. And now, decades later, we're living inside the very reality he described. Loneliness is rising. Depression is spreading. People are more connected than ever, and yet more lost, more anxious, more uncertain. And suddenly, Jung's words no longer feel abstract. They feel personal. They feel urgent. They feel, he warned us. We didn't listen. But maybe, just maybe, it's not too late to hear him now. Because the truth is, you're here. You made it to the end of this video. And that tells me something. You're not afraid to look inward. You're not afraid to question what you've been told. You're not afraid to feel what the soul has been whispering all along. So let me ask you, do you feel it? That quiet sense that something deeper is calling to be remembered, that maybe the path forward isn't in more noise, more speed, more answers, but in slowing down, turning inward, and becoming whole again. Carl Jung believed that the healing of the world starts with one soul at a time, not through grand revolutions or loud declarations, but through the courage to face your own truth. So I want to hear from you. Do you see what Jung saw? Do you feel like his warning is unfolding around us right now? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's create a space where we do listen, where the deeper questions aren't ignored. They're explored together. And if this message stirred something in you, subscribe to the channel. Because this is just the beginning. There's so much more wisdom waiting to be remembered. We may not have listened before, but now, we still can.